Hey everybody, welcome back. Kevin here. And in this video, we're going to look at adding form validation to our seat post type. Now, some things to note about post types are that when we save information, WordPress handles a bit and then TypeRocket handles a bit. And the first part is that WordPress handles saving its own fields. So for example, this published information draft, we could set it to that. And then when we hit update, WordPress is going to handle the saving of these fields. And then TypeRocket is going to handle the saving of our custom fields. So when we do field validation, we're only really going to be able to validate our own fields. If we want to validate everything on the page, then we should best move to a custom resource like we did in the previous videos where we created this flights system. Now, if we are going to add field validation to our post type, we have to understand how WordPress handles this. So when I hit update here, WordPress sends off its own request and does its own response mechanism. So in order to add field validation, we're going to have to use WordPress hooks. And luckily, TypeRocket removes that process away from us and allows us to use controllers. But instead of accessing a controller directly like we did in a previous video for our flights controller to handle validation, TypeRocket provides just a few custom actions that we can use on our controller so that it handles these edge cases for us because we're working within a post type. So with all that being said, those are kind of the constraints of working with a post type inside of WordPress and adding field validation to it. So let's jump to the code and let's look at what we did previously and then essentially replicate it for our seat post type. So we have this flight fields class and that handles all of the field validation for us. And if we scroll down here, we'll see that our rules are that the notes field is required for our flight system. Now, in order to get this to execute in our controller, we imported it into our methods create and update. And then essentially this flights controller is automatically going to execute because we set it to run in true. And this means whenever we set run to true, that flight fields class will execute when it is imported into the class. So it's going to run immediately before we do anything inside. And this does a few things for us. Primarily, it validates the fields immediately without us having to write any code, but also it causes the feature here to essentially redirect immediately with errors that those validation rules didn't pass. Therefore, if things don't validate, then we never reach the save method. So we're never going to save if things don't validate. So we want to create this same kind of effect within the seat controller here. So we want to essentially have that fields for our seat be imported into some sort of validation system. And then if that validation fails, we don't want to save any information. So the way that we can go about this is to first create that seats fields. Now I've already run this command. I'm going to clean up here and run it again so you can see. So PHP Galaxy _ flights because we're working within our flights plugin, and then we'll do make fields seat fields. And now we have our fields for our seat, and then we're going to add some rules. Now our rules will be different for this system because we are grouping our fields inside of our seat post type. So here where we've registered, if we go down to our fields, we'll see that we're saving that information to data.row. And this field system is going to look at the actual post data that's submitted into the request. So it's going to see that group data from our request. So here in the browser, let's inspect and then pull up the network tab. I'm going to hit publish here, grab one of these that has the information that we want. And then we'll see here's all of our post information. And then inside of our TR data, we have this data and then row. And so inside of our fields, we need to grab data and then row in order to validate that rule. So here in our rules, we'll do data.row. And then for now, we'll just make it required. Okay, and that's simple enough. We have this set up. And the next piece is to essentially set up our custom fields so we can actually generate some errors to validate. With this select box, it's always going to have a value because it will basically have a fixed value. So we'll just delete that and then make this a text box. We'll save this, and now we could give it some missing input, right? We can leave it empty, and then that will force the require field to fail. However, we're not validating anything yet, so we need to make sure that we validate whenever somebody submits information to our WP Post controller, that is the seat controller that is extending this controller. So what do we need to do? We need to do a special action on our controller called validate, and it will be the save method. And we'll do type here and model. And this is a similar kind of mechanism to this action piece where we have type and then the seat. So I can actually do the same thing here because we'll always be working with the seat. And then our validation does a few things. For example, if we return false, then validation will fail and we'll get that result that we're looking for where nothing gets saved. So back in the browser, if I close this out and change it to F, I'm going to hit save or update, and then it's going to switch right back to A because nothing is saved. Back at the code, if we do true, save here, go back, we change it to F here, hit update, it will save, and we're good to go. So this is an easy way to do any type of validation that you like. However, for our purposes, we're going to do field validation, though you may decide to do something like capability validation for a specific user type, whatever pleases you. So here we will do the seat fields and we'll import those. And that gets imported at the top here. And we'll do fields, we'll just call it fields. And now we have that fields information. If we were to set our fields to execute as true at this point, it's going to essentially break on us. So let's go back and hit A here, hit update, and nothing really happens, nothing has changed. And that's because WordPress has its own sort of redirect system. Again, this is a post type thing. So setting that to true isn't going to do any validation for us. So let's change this back to say null and save that. So it's not going to work again like the seat fields where we could just turn it true and it will work out of the box. So what we need to do here is we need to actually grab this field section and start validating with it. The way that we want to do this is we want to create a val variable, and then we're going to take our fields, and then we're simply going to run validate. And this will validate our rules, and then it's going to give us a validator in response to that. So these validators in WordPress, or in TypeRocket per se, give us options. So we can say, did the validation fail or pass? So what do we want to do if the validation fails? That's the main thing that we care about. And if it doesn't fail, then we'll return true because validation passed. And then, sure, if we failed, then we'll say return false. So let's test this bit first to make sure our validation rules work. In the browser, we'll change this to F. It should save. It does. And then if this field, because it's not filled out, it's no longer there and it is required, so this should fail. If I change it to A, yep, it changes it back to 1 because nothing's saved, and we have F here. So next, what we need to do is to handle the validation. So what are we going to do if validation fails? Well, we're going to take that validator and we're going to prepend to the error messages that we're going to send over. And we're going to say, hey, no fields saved. And then we need to actually send these error messages over as a flash to the user. And so we can do that by accessing our fields system. And then we basically do run and respond. And then the type of response that we want to do, there are two types of responses. There are redirects and essentially TypeRocket style responses that can work with post types. So we'll want to pass respond here. Sorry, not respond, response. And this will basically handle our response for us. So we're going to do a respond response. And that should work for us. So if we jump back to the browser, we will hit update here. It should work. Not required. hit A here, update. Okay, data row is required, no field saved. Good message. However, it would be nice if we had inline error messages as well, so let's add that. So to add inline error messages, we have to access our form and then say use errors. And then when we save the fields, do we want to send back the old fields? So do we want to use the old fields that were there on the previous request so we don't lose our data entry just because we failed? So we'll use the errors, and then we'll also re-import the fields that we had filled out before so we don't miss anything. So we'll save that. And while we're at it, you know what? This field was required, so we'll do mark label required. This just adds an asterisk next to our field. That's it. Doesn't do anything else. Refresh. We have an asterisk. We have one. I'll delete this. Change it to A. So we should keep that as A now instead of doing nothing. And this should remain blank. And then it remains blank. We have inline errors and everything is working great now. But some parts of our fields system are interesting. So for example, if we go to our seat controller and we had this request here that allowed us to get the fields, we could actually set this to be our fields instead. And I'll get to the interesting bit that I was talking about here in a second. We just have to do a little bit of setup. And we can actually take this fields and we can just import it right in here to the save mechanism. So if we do this, then before we were getting that data information, and when we hit save here, the model seat data does not know to essentially get the data for our fields. So we could do get, and then we could say data, and this would do essentially the same thing. However, if we submit just the fields, we can access a few extra features. So for example, in our data model here, we have the ability to essentially say certain fields are fillable. We talked about this in a previous video where our fillable fields basically protect us from bulk saving and anything going awry there. So maybe we say the fillable fields are row and the other one is letter. But let's say we wanted to omit this letter or the row here. How can we get our fields to save the row in a bulk import with our fields group here whenever we submit it? So part of the way that we do this, and I know I'm detouring a little bit, it's to get to the point that I was talking about the data entry here. So hang on. And so if we go here, we can actually set this fillables bit here to include row. And we can also say letter. And this will essentially override whenever it's submitted into our controller in the save method. It will say, hey, I know your model has a preference on what's fillable, but I'm going to tell you that these fields are safe as well because it's within this class. However, we still need to tell the model where to go to access that information. We need to get to that data object. And we can do that using a protected property, and it's going to be model fields group. And we'll just set that to data. And then that will handle our ability to do this sort of stuff. Now, this isn't required if you're not going to pass in the seat fields into our save method here, but it is good to note for later down the road. So with that in mind, we have our fillable fields set up, and I wanted to show you one other thing here, and that is multiple validation rules. So for right now, we've only done one validation rule, but we can actually validate multiple things. So we could say this option has to be numeric, and we can save this. Go back to the fields here. Let's just punch in some letters, and it'll say, hey, this must be numeric and it's required. So it will essentially handle the different items as they're either validated or not. So we can do this and it'll say must be numeric. If I do 1, 2, 3, update, it passes. So that numeric option actually handles the required bit for us because it's saying, hey, nothing is not numeric. And then we can tag on even more. So we could say the max number of characters is 2. So then back in our form here, 1, 2, 3 will not be valid. You can't have more than 2 characters. Update, and now our information is saved. Hit F, and we're saved. And you'll see that essentially this seat controller and the fields being passed in are handling this for us. And so there you have it. We have validation. We have seat fields being passed in instead of handling a request there. And we also have set up our form. However, we can take one more step here and make this form look a little bit nicer. So I'm going to take this form here, and we can set the fields. We can essentially echo this form out, but we don't want to include the opening and closing form tags. If we just echo the form, we'll get opening and closing form tags. And WordPress already has those for this post type, so we don't want to run into the oddities that come from having multiple forms. So we have a form tag here already wrapping everything up. We don't want another one of those. We just want the nice little wrapper UI that we have. So fields wrapper string, and then if we go back here, refresh the page, we'll get a little bit nicer UI. Things are slightly more organized. So when we hit this update, let's put some bad information in here. When we hit update, this little colored background is kind of contained. So that makes everything look a little bit nicer. And that's officially how we would handle form validation and making it look good and sort of looking at some of the edge cases. And that's it.